Hey, what's going on, everybody? This will be a quick video. Two other names I actually found while doing some more research into the quote-unquote blonde ghost network of Edwin Wilson, Frank Turple, etc. If you don't know anything about it, I highly recommend you go to YouTube and look up the documentary Frank Turple, Confessions of a Dangerous Man. But regardless, two names showed up, and one of them was Wallace Lloyd Klink, who was actually, as I discovered, one of the other Special Forces Green Berets, actually, who was actually recruited to go to Libya, um, alongside people like Luke Thompson, Eugene Tafoya, at the behest and recruitment of other Green Berets like Patry Loomis, to go to Libya to help train Gaddafi's terrorists, actually, in a pretty wild case in CIA history. I first stumbled upon his name when I was doing research upon another character, Paul Sear, who I've done two videos already on, which I highly recommend you go watch. But when I go here, there is a case in casetext.com, and it reads, what we got? Here we go. So, in March 1979, Wallace Klink, an employee of Wilson's in the United States, acting on Wilson's instructions, bought four revolvers and turned them over to Reginald Slocombe, who was actually going to be the other person I talk about, another Wilson associate. Slocombe concealed the handguns in a toolbox and checked the toolbox on a flight from Dulles International Airport to London, England, and Rotterdam, Holland. Ultimately, Wilson's employees followed his instructions, delivered the weapons to a Libyan named Izzedine Mansour in Bonn, West Germany. In Bonn, West Germany. So there's that. Okay, so there's about Wallace Klink. So Klink was this employee, right? And I kind of took some general notes. So Wallace Klink, he was a Wilson associate acting on Wilson's instructions, bought four revolvers, yada yada. So I got that. I actually found his gravestone. He's actually has a public listed a grave site on findagrave.com, and this has to be him. I'm assuming. And what I'm noticing, there's a lot of people from Pennsylvania within this network. But regardless, Wallace Lloyd Klink, he was born in 1922 in Greenville, Pennsylvania, and he passed away at the age of 73 in Southport, in North Carolina. And he's laid to rest down there in North Carolina. And what's interesting, if you look at his gravestone, actually, I'm not sure if I can blow that up. It actually says, so he's buried alongside his wife, I presume, who was 10 years his junior, Elise Klink, and he actually fought in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. So, yeah, so pretty wild stuff, you know. Um, and I also found some articles on Wallace Lloyd Klink, and it's very interesting. Like I said, rest in peace. I'm not trying to step on his service to our country or anything like that. He's just another character, one of the many names involved in this research that I'm doing about the Blonde Ghost Network of Edwin Wilson, Frank Turple, and Ted Shackley of the CIA. So there was another article that I found in the CIA reading room, published 27 July 1984 by the Washington Post, titled "Ex-Agent Linked to Delivery of Gun Used in Assassination," right? So some other names are going to show up here. So former CIA agent Edwin P. Wilson arranged for the transport from the United States to Europe of a handgun used in the May 1980 assassination of Libyan dissident in Bonn, according to court records and federal arms officials. Wilson's alleged involvement was outlined. Blow this up for you. was outlined yesterday at the federal court hearing in Alexandria, where a former Wilson associate, Wallace Klink, pleaded guilty to a charge of interstate transportation of 4 handguns without a license. Klink has told federal investigators that Wilson called him in March 1979, asking him to get the 38 and 357 caliber revolvers, but did not tell him how the guns would be used, which is a common theme in this, right? This whole network. But anyways, Assistant U.S. Attorney Theodore S. Greenberg said yesterday prosecutors have absolutely no evidence that Klink knew what they were going to be used for. So which is very interesting. That's the Assistant U.S. Attorney is saying that there's no evidence that Klink knew, right? So, like I said, just because a lot of people are, I'm mentioning their names in this network, doesn't necessarily mean that like they're as demented and evil as people like Edwin Wilson. But anyways, we are still determining what action to take with regard to Mr. Wilson, Greenberg told reporters after a brief hearing before U.S. District Court Judge Albert B. Bryan Jr. Wilson, who was arrested last month in New York and is jailed in lieu of bond totaling $40 million, has been indicted both here and in Houston on charges of exporting explosives and training terrorists in Libya and of arranging an abortive assassination plot against in 1976 against an opponent of Libyan ruler Muammar Gaddafi. Wilson also is under investigation in connection with the attempted 1980 assassination in Colorado of another exiled Gaddafi opponent. A former Green Beret who worked for Wilson in Libya was convicted of assault in the case, in which the exile was wounded twice in the head. And that is that other Green Beret they're talking about is Eugene Tafoya, who I've done a video on already. So Luke Thompson, Eugene Tafoya were 2 Green Berets recruited by a CIA liaison officer who was later fired by Stansfield Turner of the CIA named Patrick Loomis. And Patrick Loomis was actually incriminated in the Nugan hand bank scandal in Southeast Asia and Australia, alongside people like Michael Hand, who knew people like General John K. Singlaw. So back to the article, Klink, 59 at the time, of Bilton, Virginia, a retired sergeant major in U.S. Army Special Forces, worked for Wilson in Libya in 1978 for about 7 months and later lived and worked on Wilson's farm in Upperville, Virginia, which is similar to another character who I have not done a video on, but his name is Douglas Schlachter, and he was kind of like a little minion of Wilson, who also lived on his Upperville farm, right? Um, so, anyways, he would be sentenced up. He would be sentenced go up. Oh, sorry. He could be sentenced go up to 5 years in prison and a $5,000 fine for the firearm offense. Klink told investigators that in 1979 he used $1,500 he got from Wilson to buy the handguns from an associate in Fayetteville, North Carolina, which is interesting. That is where Fort Bragg, now Fort Liberty, which is home to U.S. Army Special Forces, is located. So he said he then brought them to Virginia and gave them to another Wilson employee, who hid them in a toolbox um, that was then checked aboard a flight from Dulles International Airport to London and Rotterdam. So that other person, of course, is from this article. That would be Reginald Slocombe. So Slocombe concealed the handguns in a toolbox, right? So, according to court records and an official of the U.S. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the unidentified Wilson employee, which we know who is now Reginald Slocombe, then drove the weapons to Bonn. Wow. Where they were turned over to a Libyan in front of the Libyan embassy there. Gee, so. Wow, so Lloyd bought guns in North Carolina, drove them through Virginia, handed them off to Richard Slocombe. Slocombe books a multi destination trip from DC to Heathrow in London, most likely, to Rotterdam, gets a rental car, and then drives the weapons to Bonn. So on 10 May 1980, one of those guns, a Smith & Wesson 357, was used to assassinate Amran el-Madawi, a former finance attaché and second secretary in the Libyan embassy who had refused a Gaddafi order to return to Libya. According to German prosecutors, a suspect arrested in the shooting claimed he was acting on orders of the Libyan government. The gun was traced by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms agents to Fayetteville and eventually to Klink. Excuse me. Klink's associate in Fayetteville had told investigators that Klink said the guns were going to be used for a CIA operation overseas, a statement that Klink yesterday denied making. So everybody's story doesn't match up. One person is saying that he's telling you that it's a CIA operation, but when they're in trouble, they're denying that that's the case. But then it's kablooey, right? Very gray. So there's that. And then when I go over to this article by the New York Times, the person who shot Amran el-Madawi was a person named Bashir Amida. And let me read this article real quick. It's a short one. So this one is by the New York Times, and it's called Former CIA Agent Linked to Assassin's Weapon. And this was published by Philip Topman, who's actually covered a lot of coverage about this Blondos network. And this was written on 27 July 1982. Wow, so before I was even born. So the Justice Department asserted today that Edwin P. Wilson, a former American intelligence agent accused of illegally aiding Libyan terrorists, played a role in supplying the weapon that was used to assassinate a Libyan dissident in West Germany in 1980. A former associate, Wallace Klink, pleaded guilty today in a federal district court here to firearms violations for his role in obtaining in the United States a pistol the government said was used to murder a former Libyan diplomat in Bonn. Wilson was not formally charged with any crime in today's proceedings, but Theodore S. Greenberg, an assistant United States attorney, later said that Mr. Wilson's involvement in supplying the gun was the subject to a continuing investigation. It was the first time in the 6-year investigation of Mr. Wilson's activities that the government had formally linked him to an actual assassination. So very interesting. So a lawyer for Mr. Wilson, Harold Price Faringer of New York, denied that his client had a role in supplying the gun used to kill the Libyan. In a telephone interview, Mr. Faringer said, "We would expect, if we ever had to meet the accusation, that we could successfully disprove it." Another section called Tied to Plan to Kill Exile. So Mr. Wilson was charged in 1980 with conspiracy to kill a Libyan in exile in Egypt, right? So I want to say that this must be that Muyashi guy, Umar Muyashi. But according to the Justice Department officials, that plan was aborted when the men supposedly hired by Mr. Wilson to do the killing reported the effort to the Central Intelligence Agency. So this is actually where the Cubans come into play, right? You had South Florida, Miami Cubans contracted by Wilson to go to Libya. They thought that they were going to be killing Gaddafi, when really they were going to be killing one of Gaddafi's opponents, a Umar Muhayashi, and they decided to report back to the CIA what was going on. Interestingly, one of those Cuban assassins was a person named Rafael Quintero. Rafael Quintero, alongside the person who likely recruited them, Rafael Villaverde, were people. Notably, Villaverde was a veteran of the Bay of Pigs invasion, in which Ted Shackley, Edwin Wilson, and Tom Clines were actually veterans of. And Tom Klein's, in one article I read, was actually a handler of many of these Cubans after the Bay of Pigs or whatnot, right? So Edwin Wilson being friends with Tom Klein's makes some calls to South Florida via Villa Verde. Villa Verde activates Quintero, who finds a bunch of other kind of people, and then they fly out to Switzerland, get like $30,000 plus expenses, and like they were gonna split a bounty of like $1 million or something ridiculous to go kill what they thought Gaddafi. But when they realized that wasn't what they flew there for, they ended up contacting back the Central Intelligence Agency. How? So they must have just went over Klein's, or maybe Klein's when they called back, maybe Klein's was keeping them in the dark, and when they called back, Klein's had to kind of make up an excuse about why they went there, and this probably tipped off other people in the CIA potentially. I don't know, but very interesting events with the Cubans because one of the Cubans, Rafael Villaverde, while Edwin Wilson was arrested, being investigated and about to go to court, Edwin Wilson had a bunch of hits out on people who knew about what all his dirty dealings. And interestingly, Rafael Villaverde, I want to say his boat exploded off the coast of like Florida, off of Key West or something somewhere, right? And Villaverde was also alleged to have been involved in like cocaine smuggling. Same thing with Rafael Quintero during the Iran Contra controversy. So a lot of these cases, the Blangos Network and Iran Contra kind of overlap with each other, right? So back to the article. So let me read that again. Mr. Wilson was charged in 1980 with conspiracy to kill a Libyan in exile in Egypt, but according to Justice Department officials, that plan was aborted when the men supposedly hired by Mr. Wilson to do the killing reported the effort to the Central Intelligence Agency. So, in addition, a former Green Beret soldier whom prosecutors said they believed had been hired by Mr. Wilson was convicted last year of misdemeanor assault charges in 1980 shooting of Libyan student in Fort Collins, Colorado. Um, the student survived, and Mr. Wilson was not charged. And I want to say, so the person who shot him was Eugene Tafoya, who was kind of similar to Wallace Klink. He was kind of like an older veteran whose like last glory days was in the Vietnam War, but kind of by the mid to late 70s, he was kind of out down on his luck, and he became an alcoholic. But he eventually got recruited, probably by people like Patry Loomis, and he became a loyal enforcer to Edwin Wilson, even going so far as showing up in Europe, or not, maybe not Europe, but Thomas's. He showed up to meet Thomas Klein and intimidated Thomas Klein to give back a $500,000 bridge loan that Edwin Wilson made to Thomas Klein's as Klein's was trying to set up one of his many shell companies. I forget which one it was. It wasn't API, it wasn't SSI, but it was some other shell company that Klein's, Wilson, Eric von Marbod of the Defense Cooperation Agency, which is like the agency that helps like ship munitions overseas, and I want to say Richard Secord was involved in it, and maybe someone else. But regardless, there was a business deal that went dirty, and Wilson basically uh, sent to FOIA to pat him down and get him his money back. But this Tafoya guy also was incriminated in a car bombing somewhere. I want to say in it's like Kitchener, Ontario. But he was also incriminated, or he was actually sentenced to assault, not necessarily murder, but assault and shooting Libyan dissident. His name was Fazil Zagali, in the head twice. So this guy was insane, right? Eugene Tafoya, in and of himself, is just an interesting case, right? And Eugene Tafoya actually connects to another cast of characters I have not talked about, called the China Lake Naval Weapons Facility employees, which is a totally another rabbit hole to go down. But back to the article about Wallace Klink, right? So Mr. Wilson, a former covert agent for the agency, was indicted in 1980 of charges of illegally shipping explosives to Libya as part of a project to train terrorists. In 1976, the Justice Department, he and another agent, former agent Frank E. Turple, made a deal with Colonel Muammar el-Gaddafi, the Libyan leader, to sell their expertise in intelligence and military matters to Libya. So Wilson was apprehended last month in New York and is in custody awaiting trial. Mr. Turple is a fugitive, reportedly living in Beirut, Lebanon. So another section of this article is called "Said to Have Ordered Pistols." So Mr. Wilson's role in the West German assassination was said by the Justice Department to have begun in March 1979 when he telephoned Mr. Klink overseas and instructed him to purchase 4 pistols. So at the time, Mr. Klink was employed by Mr. Wilson as a farmhand at his Upperville, Virginia estate, which is interesting because Wilson did the same thing to Douglas Schlachter, who was also another kind of underling and money runner and courier for Wilson, who later was hiding out in Burundi, Africa, for fear of his life, and he came back to the United States, was arrested, and actually was like a witness, I want to say, in Wilson's Alexandria, Virginia trial, and like he had to wear a bulletproof vest because people thought that Wilson was going to try to have him assassinated. So Mr. Klink, a former member of U.S. Army Special Forces or Green Berets, worked for Mr. Wilson in Libya before moving to the Virginia farm, the government said. He was one of more than a dozen former Green Berets whom Mr. Wilson recruited in 1977 to be instructors at the Libyan terrorist training project, according to federal prosecutors. After the telephone conversation with Mr. Wilson, the government said Mr. Klink obtained $1,500 from Mr. Wilson's money from another Wilson associate and traveled to Fayetteville, North Carolina, site of the Fort Bragg Special Forces headquarters. So that's interesting. Let me see something here. So in this other article, it says Klink told investigators in 1979 he used $1,500 he got from Wilson to buy handguns there. So they don't really name this person, but it looks like, because this is before the handoff to Reginald Slocombe. So I wouldn't be surprised if this was Douglas Schlachter, who was this unnamed person who handed the money for Wilson to William Klink, and then William Klink hands the guns to Reginald Slocombe, who smuggles them into Europe and drives them into West Germany to give to the Libyan assassin. So with the help of a friend, Mr. Klink bought the 4 weapons ordered by Mr. Wilson, telling his friend, according to the government, that they were needed for a Central Intelligence Agency operation outside the United States. One of the guns was a Smith & Wesson pistol, weapons shipped to Europe. So Mr. Klink returned to Virginia, according to the Justice Department. Mr. Wilson told him to turn the weapons over to another Wilson associate, that's the Reginald Slocombe, who packed them in a toolbox. Sometime in March or April, that associate, who was not identified by the government, flew the box, that's Slocombe again, flew the box to Rotterdam via London. From there, the associate drove them to Bonn, right? So in this article, they're saying that the government did not identify, but if we go over here to this article on the CIA reading room, I want to say, no, we just read it. But basically, yeah, they put them It was the Slocum guy. Yeah, so Slocum concealed him in a hand box, chucked him into a toolbox, yada yada. Following this, delivered the weapons to a Libyan named Ezzedine Monsieur in West Bonn, right? So no need to get too confused about all the order of events, but so the government reported that the pistols were delivered in Bonn to a Libyan, the Ezzedine Monsieur, outside the Libyan embassy. The receipt was not identified. More than a year later, on May 10, 1980, the gun was used by Bashir Admida to kill Amran El Madawi, the former finance attaché and second secretary in the Libyan embassy in Bonn. The Justice Department charged. Justice Department officials said that Mr. Admida was in custody in West Germany. Okay, so Wilson gives money to Klink, or Wilson gives money to an unnamed associate, I'm assuming Douglas Schlachter, who also lived and was probably familiar with Wilson's Upperville, Virginia farm, in which he also worked on, similar to Klink. So the money goes from Wilson to Douglas Schlachter to William Klink. William Klink goes down to Fayetteville, North Carolina, has a contact who can get some guns. He buys like a 38 caliber, 350 caliber Smith and Wesson models or whatnot. Then he hands those guns off to Reginald Slocombe, who works for Around World Shipping and Charter in Houston, Texas. Um, However, they're not flown out of Houston, Texas. Rather, these guns are put in a toolbox by Slocum, flown to London, then to Rotterdam. Then from Rotterdam, Slocum gets in a rental car, drives to Bonn, and hands them off to a Libyan named Ezzedine Monsieur, which I'm assuming is not his real last name, being a Libyan. And then that gun is used to assassinate, is given to another person, Bashir Edmida, and Bashir Edmida later kills Amran El Madawi, who was kind of like an accountant finance person at a Libyan embassy in West Germany. So, series order of operations, right? So the victim, reportedly a critic of Colonel Gaddafi, had refused to return to Libya in 1978 when his assignment in Bonn ended, American officials said. In 1979 and 1980, at least 8 Libyan expatriates were killed in Europe as part of what American officials said was an effort by Colonel Gaddafi to eliminate opposition to his government. Mr. Klink, in today's proceedings, pleaded guilty to the illegal interstate transportation of firearms. He denied having told his friend in Fayetteville, North Carolina, that the weapons were intended for an agency operation. So, so interesting. One of the people who helps him get the guns is basically saying he said it was for a CIA operation, I think. But then the other guy comes back around and says, let me see here. So, with the help of a friend, Mr. Klink bought 4 weapons ordered by Mr. Wilson, telling his friend, according to the government, that they were needed for the CIA. So, Klink and his friend are basically countering each other's stories. So, Mr. Klink, if convicted, would face a possible prison term of 5 years and a $5,000 fine for his role in the weapons violations. Ooh, wow, pretty interesting. So another Green Beret caught up in gun running and stuff like that, similar to Eugene Tafoya, and kind of similar to Luke Thompson. And Luke Thompson was involved in like Phoenix program operations and stuff like that in Vietnam. He was also recruited by Patry Loomis. So pretty wild stuff. So now the next person is a person named Reginald Slocombe, right? So we know Reginald Slocombe was a worker at Around World Shipping and Chartering, which was one of the many shell companies by Wilson. And interestingly, that business shared an office space with API Distributors, which is a business was a business among many other shell businesses ran and owned by Tom Clines. Tom Clines at API Distributors, after Ted Shackley retired from the CIA, Ted Shackley went to go work for API, and interestingly, one of the Cubans, Rafael Quintero, was listed in kind of in like a position of authority within the organization. So they use some of these shell organizations to basically hire, CIA people to make their work seem legitimate and hire assassins and stuff like that, right? So they can actually show income and regular jobs and employments and covers and everything, right? So, so Richard Slocombe, right? So this is from the UPI article published in 16 February 1983 by John Pryor, former CIA agent Edwin Wilson and his son Eric. So former CIA agent Edwin Wilson and his son Eric were indicted Wednesday on charges they plotted to kill two federal prosecutors in Washington and four potential witnesses as the senior Wilson at the senior Wilson's trial. So even he brought his own son into this mix. So a federal grand jury in Manhattan alleged the plot to murder prosecutors, witnesses, and others was hatched during November and December 1982 when Edwin Wilson was locked up in the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York, right? Which is interesting because I think according to my notes here, Edwin Wilson, when locked up, he tried to first he tried to hire an Aryan Brotherhood hitman, but the person who helped set him up with the Aryan Brotherhood person was a jail informant. I think his name was William Trimmer or something like that, who was a convicted murderer himself. But this convict who Wilson thinks he's going to hire Aryan Brotherhood's hitman through actually ends up giving him to a FBI informant or whatever, so they're able to throw more charges on top. But Wilson, being insane, doesn't give up and actually ends up trying to contract another killer to take out federal prosecutors, Larry Barcella, Carol E. Bruce, and a bunch of other business associates whom Wilson thought screwed him over. And he ends up trying to hire a person named William Arrico, who was an associate, interestingly, of Michelle Sedona, who was one of the shadowy figures involved in the Banco di Ambrosiano scandal. And I want to say the Franklin Bank or something. It was this weird international banking scandal that preceded that came before the Banco Ambrosiano scandal of Roberto Calvi, which is another part of CIA lore because this attaches to the Propaganda Do or P2 Masonic Lodge, which was essentially a far right shadow government in Italy backed by the CIA, who were essentially allowed to do terrorism against left wing forces. And they were notable for supporting far right terrorist groups in the era of violence in Italy known as the Years of Lead. So that's just another crazy tangent about how all this stuff is connected. But so, and what's interesting, he was Edwin Wilson, right? As you're seeing here on the screen, he was locked up at Metropolitan Correctional Center, right? Which is the infamous, I want to say that's the infamous jail that even Jeffrey Epstein and Diddy and a lot of higher ups in New York are they're kind of put in jail at, instead of sending them to Rikers Island to the gladiator school over there where they'll be torn apart alive probably. They end up just kind of booking them into the Metropolitan Correctional Center, which is not a very good jail, by the way. It's almost condemned, I believe. But back to the article. So the Wilsons, the indictment said, plotted to hire hitmen to murder assistant U.S. attorneys Larry Barcella and Carol Bruce. It also involved a scheme to kill potential witnesses against the senior Wilson. Jerome Brower, an explosives dealer, Howard Coughlin, a lawyer, Rafael Quintero, a Cuban involved in the Libyan assassination scheme. It looks like whomever got to Rafael Villaverde was successful. And Reginald Slocombe, who handled Wilson's shipping operations. Remember, at his shell company, around world shipping, freight and shipping, right? Because in all the other videos I've read, one of the main things that Edwin Wilson was really good at doing was setting up shell companies, which he did in his early CIA career because he joins the CIA, Wilson, after serving in the Korean War. He ends up joining the Office of Security, where he's essentially kind of like an over glamorized spy security guard. In a way, like he's basically just keeping tabs on U-2 pilots and their family to make sure they're not, defecting or giving away information. He's doing wiretaps. He's he's an advanced man, I think, which is like a person who goes into a room before important dignitaries arrive in order to make sure they're not, rigged with bugs or explosives and stuff like that. But he eventually realized that his career wasn't going to go anywhere unless, which is not necessarily true, but to himself, he thought his career wasn't going to go anywhere unless he went to the clandestine service. So he ends up getting promoted into the clandestine service somewhere in the 50s, where he actually meets Tom Clines, who becomes his supervisor. But because he's in the clandestine service, he can't. If the CIA doesn't want them to be employees, they want them to be kind of contractors so they can have plausible deniability in the event something goes wrong. So, but you're still required to follow all the protocols, procedures of the CIA. So you're in the CIA, but for diplomatic reasons, you're not in the CIA. So he ends up leading a pretty successful uh, career in clandestine services, notably as notably as having a labor union rep for shipping as his cover, notably being stationed in Europe, also a little bit in Latin America, also in Southeast Asia. Um, but then he's, I think, given like another promotion within clandestine services, in which he kind of becomes like the chief person of maritime logistics of clandestine services, making sure that like if they need something delivered by water, he's the guy. So as a result, he gets really good at setting up kind of phony third party logistics and freight forwarding companies. But these companies end up making money, turning a profit. So he gets to keep the profit, but the agency doesn't care just as long as they're able to get their guns, weapons, munitions, uniforms to whatever revolutions they're funding across the globe. So Wilson kind of becomes emboldened in a sense, and I think he starts realizing that doing there's more money to be made in the free market than by loyally serving your country. And his moral compass essentially gets more damaged after that. And in the early 70s, he ends up meeting Frank Turple, who was earlier fired by the CIA for smuggling contraband in diplomatic pouches and going AWOL from his posting in India, getting trapped in Afghanistan during the Indian Pakistan War, and is later let loose by the CIA. He goes into arms smuggling, and at a Christmas party, interestingly, in Virginia for CIA alumni, Turple links up with Wilson, and then the birth of the Blonde Ghost Network, as we know, kind of begins. Um, so back to the article. So the senior Wilson is in federal custody awaiting sentencing Friday in Houston on charges he conspired to ship tons of plastic explosives to Libya. He was sentenced in December in Alexandria, Virginia, to 18 years in prison for smuggling firearms to Bonn, West Germany. So Wilson also is awaiting trial in Washington, D.C., beginning March 1st for illegally acting as an agent for Libya and exporting to Libya for profit various explosives and military hardware. So in Alexandria, Virginia, he's on trial for a lot of the gun running, assassination type stuff. In DC, he's on trial for like really like the large case of like supporting the Qaddafi government. So his son Eric, who was 22 and living in Washington State, I think surrendered to federal prosecutors in Manhattan Wednesday and was awaiting arraignment later in the day. Um, so I say Washington State because I want to say that Edwin Wilson actually ended up passing away in Washington State. So two other alleged targets, the indictment said, were Ernest Kaiser, who is this weird, like probably Nazi in hiding, who became like a government informant, who helped lure back Edwin Wilson to the United States on the promise that Edwin Wilson was going to be, of use to the National Security Council. But Ernest Kaiser set him up, and he was arrested by the Dominican Republic officials and then sent back to, I think, New York or D.C. And this Kaiser guy, interestingly, was also an informant, um, trying to take down a very infamous money launderer named Robert Vesco in the 1980s, who was like this playboy guy who had ties to like Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, who is like one of the founders of the Bilderberg Group. So really weird stuff there. But anyways, the prosecutor Eugene Kaplan said that Wilson sought out hitmen who were to receive fees ranging from $50,000 to $500,000 for the murders of each witness, prosecutors and others. So there's that article. And this is another article by the Washington Post, 18 December 1982. Wilson's Libya explosives deal detailed, and this is in the CIA's reading room documents. So, all right. So Wilson's Libya explosives deal. So by Dan Balls. So December 17th. Former CIA agent Edwin P. Wilson contracted and paid for the shipment of 40,000 pounds of plastic explosives to Libya in 1977, the owner of a California explosive firm said to testify today. The explosives dealer, Jerome S. Brower, testified in U.S. District Court here that he met with Wilson in mid 1977 in Washington to begin the transaction and met with Wilson in Libya. Wow. So actually, Brower actually met with Wilson in Libya. I did not know that. In October when the shipment of explosives arrived there. So Wilson, who was convicted last month in Alexandria, Virginia, of exporting 4 handguns and an M16 rifle to Libya. So this is where the Paul Sear thing comes into the mix, and this is where the Wallace Klink and Reginald Slocombe thing come into the mix here. So exporting 4 handguns and an M16 rifle to Libya, faces trial here on charges of exporting explosives to Libya. So today's pre-trial hearing before U.S. District Court Judge Ross N. Sterling was held to determine if there is sufficient evidence of a conspiracy to allow hearsay testimony in Wilson's trial, which is scheduled to begin next month. Wilson is to be sentenced in Alexandria on Monday. Brower, an unindicted co-conspirator whose left hand is missing several fingers, said the explosives were paid for out of 5,888, $588,000 that was deposited in his Swiss bank account. So he said he had charged Wilson $13.7 a pound, and that Wilson has sold the explosives to the Libyans for $20 a pound. Said that the explosives were paid for. Wow. So Brower, this guy was, he knew the game, Swiss bank accounts. So Brower said that he bought the explosives called C4 or RDX in the summer of 1977 from 3 firms, one in Canada, one in New Orleans, and a third in Texas. To disguise the shipment, the explosives were repackaged in 850-gallon containers, I believe, of drilling mud. So the explosives were placed at the bottom of cans, and the rest of the container was filled with commercial oil drilling mud. So the labels on the outside of the packages contain safety instructions for explosive C4, but Wilson said that the long chemical name of the explosive was used. None bore a label with the word explosive. So he's getting a little tricky, right? Knowing that most people don't know the chemical name, right? So the shipping was handled through associates of a firm owned by Wilson called Around World Shipping and Charter Co., according to testimony of Reginald Slocombe, president of the company and an unidentified co-conspirator. I want to say that co-conspirator, it doesn't matter actually. So the company had offices in Washington. So Slocum said that because the explosives cannot legally be shipped from the United States, it was decided that the job should be done by some company other than Around World Shipping. It's stuff called C4 and it's not supposed to be shipped, Slocum told Edison Fraser, air cargo director for Around World Shipping, in a tape played in court today. Okay, so Slocum was the president, quote unquote, on paper, even though he's really a gun runner. And then we also have Edison Fraser, who's the quote unquote cargo director. So it's almost kind of like he does like a lot of the packing and shipping of stuff or whatever, but I don't know. But going down here, so Frazier, another unidentified co-conspirator, testified that he had been put in charge of finding a shipper and has settled on Donald R. Thresher, a Houston businessman in the freight forwarding business. Wow, another name that I have to write down. Slocum testified that Wilson was getting anxious for the explosives to be shipped and that there was a problem obtaining an airplane to carry the cargo to Libya. In late September, Slocum, Fraser, Thresher, and Edward Bloom, another name, an attorney working for Brower, flew to Miami to lease a plane to ship the cargo at a cost of $60,000. So the plane was loaded in Houston on October 2nd or 3rd, 1973, and customs documents were falsified to get cargo out of the country. So in the middle of the night, the plane left Houston for Lisbon with Bloom aboard, Fraser said. Brower testified that he had flown separately to Lisbon, then accompanied the cargo into Libya. I mean, when you're shipping 40,000 pounds of C4, I guess flying in a different plane is probably a wise decision. Um, so in Libya, Brower said he called Wilson to get someone to unload the cargo. Brower said his passport was lifted there, and he waited for several days at Wilson's apartment until he was told the explosives were all right. So Brower said his passport was lifted. I don't really know what that means. I think they might be meaning that they actually took his passport and kind of in theory kind of held him hostage to make sure that the explosives were like good. So at one point today, Brower described silver medallions he had given to several employees working in Libya. They were to be used for identification purposes. He said he carried one himself as a lucky piece, but it didn't work, did it? Judge Sterling said in response to his Honor's question. No, sir, Brower replied. Wow, geez, so much more information there. Um, and the last article is by United Press International, published um, 31 January 1983 by Barbara Canetti in Houston. And this article, so we're still focusing on Reginald Slocombe. So when a plane loaded with high explosives cargo set off from Texas on a mission to terrorist Libya, Reginald Slocombe said he contacted his business partner, ex-CIA agent Edwin Wilson, with the long-awaited message: "The bird has flown the coop. was the message, according to Slocombe, who is testifying against Wilson in Houston. He, Wilson, had been on my case to get it done, and now I could say it's gone. The plane is gone. Slocombe, an unindicted co-conspirator in the case, testified Monday that Wilson told him he was no longer working for the CIA. But Wilson, 54, a multimillionaire who spent 15 years in undercover spy operations with the CIA, claims he was working with high-level American government officials on a secret mission when the explosive plastic materials were sent to Libya in October 1977. The federal government says Wilson sent the weapons to line his pockets with money. Heavy security surrounded the trial, now in its second week, with about 10 armed federal marshals guarding the courtroom, judge, jury, and Wilson. Two armed federal prosecutors and at least five government witnesses against Wilson allegedly have been placed on a hit list, pinned by Wilson while he was in a New York jail cell. Slocombe, one of those on the alleged hit list, said that he first met Wilson in 1976 and 1977 when Wilson offered him a job. At the same time, Slocombe said Wilson said he was no longer working with the CIA. So, also testifying Monday was an American lawyer, Edward Coughlin Jr., who lives in Geneva, Switzerland, and handled Wilson's financial affairs in 1977. So Coughlin, also named on the alleged contract killing list, testified that in August 1977, a $900,000 deposit was made in Wilson's Swiss bank account from the Libyan government bank. A withdrawal amounting to $585,000 was made and transferred to another numbered account belonging to California weapons expert Jerome Bauer, um, who testified he sold 42,300 pounds of explosive plastics to Wilson for shipment to the Libyan soldiers. Brower said he charged Wilson of 565,000 for the shipment. Wow. So Wilson apparently feared his telephone conversation with Slocum were being monitored, and instructed Slocum to not use the office phones when discussing the Libyan deals. So we felt there was a possibility our phones were tapped at the business, so we used outside phones, Slocum said, indicating Wilson thought either the FBI, CIA, or other federal authorities were tapping the phone. Ooh, wow. And there's a third person, lastly, actually, so let me see here. So this is actually another article. So Richard Slocum. Actually, I'm not going to read this one. It's already general gist of what's been said. But that's wild, man. So yeah. So these are two more people. So we got uh, Wallace Lloyd Klink and what you call it and Robert Slocum, right? So let's try to recap some things here, right? So William Klink, ex Special Forces, he's working on the farm of Wilson in Upperville, Virginia, similar to Douglas Schlachter. It seems that Klink got $1,500, most likely from Douglas Schlachter, to go to Fayetteville, North Carolina, meet up with a friend. He tells his friend he's working for the CIA. He needs four handguns, like some 38s and some 357 Smith and Wesson editions. He gets the guns, takes them back to Virginia, hands them off to Robert Slocum, who's the president of Around World Shipping and Chartering, based in Houston. Slocum takes the guns to London, then to Rotterdam, drives from Rotterdam to Bond, hands them off to Ezzedine Monsieur, most likely a code name for a Libyan working in some of the Libyan embassies in Western Germany. And then eventually another person, a Bashir Amida, ends up killing a Libyan dissident with that weapon or whatnot. But also, Richard Slocombe, is also involved in the shipping of the 40,000 pounds of C4 from Houston, in which it's described that the shipping was handled through associates of a firm owned by Wilson, this Around World Shipping and Chartering, according to Richard Slocombe. And Slocombe ends up working with Edison Fraser, who's the cargo director. And because they don't want to use their own company to ship it or whatnot, they find another person, a Donald R. Thresher, a Houston businessman in the freight forwarding business. And Slocombe testified that Wilson was getting anxious about the explosives being delivered. But in late September, Slocombe, Fraser, Thresher, and Edward Bloom, an attorney working for Brower, in which Brower is the Californian-based person who provided the RDX and C4, they all go to Miami to lease a plane. And then they use that plane leased from Miami, which was hooked up by Ronald R. Thresher to fly the C4 from Houston into Europe and then into Libya. So, some wild stuff there. So, with that being said, I'm probably just going to wrap it up for this video. So, like I said, the two names are Wallace Klink and Reginald Slocombe, right? So, thank you for your time. And this is just some more information about the Blonde Ghost Network by Quentin Mitchell. All right. Thank you. Peace.